Welcome to Day 4 of Tamil Heritage Trust Indology Festival 2020. Thank you for joining today's festival. We hope that you participated in the previous days of this festival, and we look forward to your continued participation for the rest of this event. Before we start today's proceedings, a quick introduction to Tamil Heritage Trust and its activities. Tamil Heritage Trust was founded in the year 2010 and is an organization based in Chennai. The purpose of Tamil Heritage Trust is to create a platform that enables understanding, appreciation, celebration, dissemination of the rich Indian heritage. Towards this, we run different programs and events. Through our monthly talks, we offer a platform for both serious enthusiasts and experts alike to talk about various a wide range of subjects that come under the gamut of Indian heritage. This could be topics like architecture, painting, sculpture, music, literature, and various other aspects of our Indian heritage. We also run intense workshops for the general public. One of the workshops that we offer is called How to See a Temple, which is a workshop aimed at helping the general public gain better appreciation of the heritage inside a temple. This includes aspects like the temple architecture, iconography, and the inscriptions. We also run other workshops such as the Pallava Grantha workshop, which is helped at enabling participants towards reading and deciphering the Grantha script and be able to read inscriptions in Pallava era monuments such as Mamallapuram and Kanchipuram. Every year, during the Chennai Music Festival in December, we also run a two-day workshop, a two-day seminar, which is a series of talks, which is called Pechu Kacheri. This Pechu Kacheri is basically a series of lectures organized around a central topic. Another feature of the Tamil Heritage Trust's activities is the annual site seminar. Every year, we organize this during the month of January, and we visit a heritage site in India, which not just includes visiting the heritage site, but also intense preparation in the months leading up to the tour. Recently, the Trust also instituted the THT Professor Swaminathan Award to recognize an individual who has made exceptional contributions towards understanding, dissemination, and preservation of the Indian heritage. With this Indology Festival, Tamil Heritage Trust is looking to bring experts not just within India, but also around the world to celebrate Indology. During this week-long festival, our endeavor is to enable collaboration and exchange of ideas between experts, academia, and a heritage-loving audience. Keeping in mind the festive spirit, we have also organized several contests around the festival. If you are a heritage blogger, or if you like to write about heritage, or if you like to take videos about heritage monument, these contests would be a great fit for you. The program itself is structured for 7 days. Every day we would have 2 talks starting 7 p.m. India time. The talks will be followed by a discussion with the program chair, and then that will be followed by a Q&A with the audience. We request all participants to type their questions in the YouTube chat session. Today is the 4th day of the festival. We also encourage participants to spread the word about this Indology Festival. If you're on social media, please share about this festival widely using the hashtag THT Indofest 2020. That is THT Indofest 2020. I would now like to introduce our program chair, who will then introduce today's speakers. It is my great pleasure to introduce Madhusudanan Kalaiselvan. Madhusudanan is an architect by profession, and he specializes in the conservation and architectural research. He has also been a mentor to students from various architectural schools. He is well versed in the field of art, architecture, heritage, cultural studies, and vernacular practices. He is also a popular speaker on a wide range of subjects pertaining to Indian heritage. He curates and conducts tours to various places of architectural and cultural interest. His contributions have earned him the well-coveted Vedavalli Memorial Award for Outstanding Service by a young achiever in the field of South Indian heritage. Madhusudan is also the recipient of the first edition of the THT Professor Swaminathan Award, which he received this year in 2020. I would like to now hand over the program to our program chair, Madhusudan Kalaichal. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamil Heritage Trust, for that introduction and the privilege here to chair this session. Like many of you, I was also curious to know how exactly Tamil Heritage Trust is going to handle its Pechu Kacheri, which over the years has become a significant part of the typical Chennaites Margadi calendar. With several kacheris, music and dance and drama happening around, if there is an organization that strives to work towards heritage and present something very conceptual, well put, very well planned, and organizes it at a level where you really don't think it's just a bunch of volunteers who are working behind it. Tamil Heritage Trust, of course, needs no introduction. It's quite popular as an organization that is run by volunteers, so much so professional that you really doubt if it's just volunteers or is it more. Very committed professionals committed towards heritage, Tamil culture, Indian arts, Indian architecture, various verticals of heritage. And though they call themselves as non-profit organizations at their level, I should say, audience, all of us are all profited at an immense level. So this organization's activities that was just discussed, the star attraction of their annual calendar is, of course, the December Pechu Kacheri, which was started, of course, as a week-long program. Then it got reduced to a weekend sessions. And this year, with all programs formulating their own method to accommodate it, given the challenges around, we have Tamil Heritage Trust, which is shifted its Pechu Kacheri into a very, very interesting format online and celebrating Indology, calling it as Indology Festival, calling experts from various different fields, picking out different verticals of Indology, organizing it, put together a week-long session, a week-long program with sessions, chaired sessions, and you have two experts in similar fields working on different branches of similar fields to share their knowledge with us, generic and specific to their research. And today we have architecture as the core topic, Indian architecture to be specific, taken. Architecture is, of course, one of the most ancient technologies, aesthetics involved, and that which has been there, researched upon ever since human race started being active here on Earth. Shelter is one amongst the three basic requirements, and architecture evolves from there. However, humble, with a lot of aesthetics added to it, material technology, engineering, planning parts, structural aspects. So putting space into efficient usage, all of this makes architecture a kind of art supported with technology and technical aspects. Here in India, ours is one of the most ancient architectural system that has evolved region specific and has general features across the country. So as an ancient civilization, Indian architecture boasts of various different schools that has evolved over different regions, over different periods, different phases, taking into consideration climatic condition, topographic constraints, material availability, need and necessity, culture, religion, society, economics, all of these will have an impact either directly or indirectly in any ancient school of architecture. And here in India, we have a school that has flourished, documented through literature several thousand years back, and now in practice, at least a little more than 2000 years. Every region has its own region-specific text which speaks about the grammar, but I should say some of the samples that we have are dated much even before these texts or guidebooks or manuals for architecture came in. And to explore Indian architecture, which is the central theme for today's, over the Indology week, the festival that we are celebrating, today's topic and specific area of concentration is architecture. So we have two experts specialized and very popular in their own field of expertise here with us to share their knowledge. I take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Adam Hardy and Dr. G. Shankaranarayanan, the two speakers for today's sessions. Dr. Adam Hardy, an emeritus professor of Asian architecture at Cardiff University, UK, has his PhD on how temples developed in Karnataka between the 7th and the 13th century. Predominantly, we feel that Karnataka is all about Hoysalas or Chalukyas to an extent, then zero down that it is all Nagara style of architecture, which is a very, very blanket preconceived notion. And we have his work, which covers a considerable period, the period that which was very active. In fact, architecture was very actively taken up, and several critical examples of different periods, different phases evolved between the 7th and the 13th century. And we have an expert whose doctoral research is from there. Authored several books, a few of which include Indian Temple Architecture, Form and Transformation, The Temple Architecture of India, Theory and Practice of Temple Architecture in Medieval India, Bhojas, Samarangana Sutradhara, and Bhojpuri line drawings. So that's like yet another sphere of Indian architecture, very classical and fine school of architecture from Central India. And his current research is on the Nagara tradition of temple architecture, Tamil temple towns, conservation and contestation. So that's like covering across the length and breadth of the country, different schools and expertise, which culminates into specification and research from different schools of architecture across India. He's designed new temples, a very popular one being the Hoysala temple in all its grandeur that's coming up, wherein he's recreated the Hoysala style. He's the editor of South Asian Studies Journal and president of European Association of South Asian Archaeology and Art. What more can we expect from the expert who is invited today? He seems to have everything that is from Indian traditional architecture, different schools. So we are really privileged and happy to welcome you, sir, Dr. Adam Hardy. So we have Dr. Adam Hardy, who's going to be presenting on the topic. The topic for his session for today is the unfolding universe of Nagara temple architecture. He's going to be talking about the tradition of temple architecture that kind of predominated the scene across the whole of North India between the 6th and 12th century. And wherein it has periodic revivals, as it passed from one century to another, from one dynasty to another. And the main areas of the talk is going to be on the importance of typology, and not just the classification part, and how material differences was brought in, the difference between Nagara and Dravida, and the architectural expression of a downward and an outward movement, expression of downward and an outward movement. Finally, it's going to also cover theory and practice as it is seen in the manuals, the text that we have like Vastu Shastra, Shilpa Shastra, and how that gets shifted over when it comes to actual site practice. So that's going to be Dr. Adam Hardy's talk. So without further delay, I'll hand over the mic to Dr. Adam Hardy and sit back and enjoy the sessions.
Hello, happy to be with you, even though I can't see you, which is weird, but I'm very happy to be with you. The talk today is called The Unfolding Universe of Nagara Temple Architecture. Nagara and Dravida, as I'm sure you all know, are the two main divisions of Indian temple architecture, respectively from North and South India. Nagara literally of the city, but the term applies to the tradition which dominated much of North Indian temple architecture from its genesis around the 5th century through a heyday which lasting up to about the 12th century, and then with periodic survivals and revivals up to the present day. We can call Nagara and Dravida styles of architecture, but I think it's quite fruitful to think of them as architectural languages. They're like a kit of parts which can be put together in different ways and create different forms or modes of architecture. This is my little chart of the different temple forms with the centuries running down the left-hand side, and we have south to north along the bottom. So Dravida on the right, Nagara on the left. And at the top, we see 5 early prototypical shrine forms made of wood and thatched, roofed with thatch, which we know from various fragments and relief carvings. And these are like the seeds of later traditions of monumental stone and brick temple architecture. These forms themselves get transformed into stone and brick, monumentalized, and then combined in different ways to make new forms of temples. So the temple form, the typology of temples goes right back to those early prototypes, and the creative process of designing temples has always consisted of taking established forms and combining them together to make new forms in inventive kinds of ways. So the tradition we're looking at in this little talk is the mainstream Nagara tradition that you see on the right in this diagram. And in between we have Vesara, formed out of Dravida language, but developing in a different way. Varata, which is an early form which shares the precedence of both the Nagara and Dravida traditions. And Bhumija, which is a more northern form, but which is aware of the southern traditions. Now, by way of comparison, let's just look at the typical way of composing a South Indian Dravida temple, because in some ways it's easier to grasp immediately than the northern temples. The early shrine forms that are the original ingredients are the kind of shrine crowned by a kuta, a domed pavilion, or by a shala, a barrel vaulted pavilion. And those get turned into stone or brick. They become alpa vimanas, the simplest forms of vimana. And then they become the components of more complicated forms. So in this example here is the Bhutnath temple at Badami. In a typical way, a kuta topped alpa vimana is at the top. And then we have, in this case, 2 tiers or talas with kuta-topped shrines on the corners and shala-topped shrine images at the center on the cardinal axes. So the temple is one house for the god made up of many small houses for gods. Now, by comparison, if we look at early Nagara temples, or the formation of the Nagara temple, the main ingredients are 2 early shrine forms. One is a type crowned by an amlaka, that ribbed member, and the other, which we can call the proto-Vallabhi shrine form, is the one that goes back to the type of building that we see exemplified in the Buddhist Chaitya hall. Rock-cut examples which transform the wooden thatched version into stone, and then used as an aedicule or a shrine image, either with a single horseshoe arch or with a nave and aisles, like the grander type of Chaitya hall. So how does this get transformed into proto-Nagara or early Nagara temples? This is the doorway from the Vishnu temple at Deogar from around 500 AD. The superstructure of the temple has disappeared, but if we look at the doorway, we see at the sides small representations of temple forms, which are the kind of principle that the actual superstructure of the temple would have followed. So you see one of those here on the right, and we see these two prototypical aedicule forms further over on the right. And you can see, rather in the same way as a Dravida form has a fat kuta aedicule on the top, this one has a fat version of the Amlaka shrine at the top, and then little ones of those on the corners, and then a Vallabhi shrine form or type placed at the center. The sort of process that would have led to that kind of form, I'm summarizing in this diagram. So a typical way, or two typical ways of combining temple types. One is to take one type and make it the top of a more complicated type. And another is to take one type and to project another type from the center. And this is the kind of thing that happens. We can see it from fragmentary evidence. So you take one of those Amlaka topped shrines, it becomes the top of something with an extra story. And then we put little ones on the corners and project a Vallabhi element at the center. And then another story. Little ones of those Amlakas on the corners, and then Vallabhis cascading down like that. Now, all we have to do to transform that into the early, fully mature, typical Nagara temple form known as the Latina, with its curved spire or shikara, is give it a curvature and merge those separate Vallabhi elements into a single continuous spine, or lata, or creeper. So we've seen how different shrine forms or aedicules are put together to compose the temple. Two other principles follow on from that. If we look at the relationship between these images of shrines, we see, particularly in certain traditions, a sense of dynamism, of movement, a pattern of emerging, expanding, proliferating forms, downwards and outwards from the center. And if we look at the way traditions develop across the centuries, particularly certain traditions, including the Nagara tradition that I'm talking about, we see the same kind of pattern of emergence, of proliferation, of emanating forms, one form coming one from another. That's not surprising because the earlier temple forms are incorporated in the progressively more elaborate forms. So to look at this expression of movement in a single temple, we'll go back to the Galaganatha temple that I used as my example of a Latina temple, 7th century, and look at the central lata and the pattern that it creates with these Gavaksha forms splitting and emerging is like this. to represent it graphically, it's something like this. That's at the top of the latta, then 6 times down the face of the shikara. Goes like this and then ends up with that. So this kind of pattern of emanation of one thing coming out of another and then another from that is one that we know well from theological hierarchies and cosmogonies that you find recurrently in Indian philosophy and mythology, embodied in a very concrete way. For example, in the story of Vishnu and Anantashayin, Vishnu reclining in the cosmic void, the lotus grows from his navel, and then Brahma appears from the lotus and creates the universe. So one thing comes out of another and another out of that. With the Lingodipava, the origin of the linga emerges from the void, grows and expands, an orifice appears, and Shiva emerges and expands. And Vishnu dives down and Brahma flies up, and it ever expands. And in the picture we see here, we see a typical device in Dravida architecture where the pilaster is split. The two halves seem to emerge apart, and then the linga comes through, and the effect is like this. So those are the kinds of patterns that we see in the development of traditions. But interestingly, in the Tamil Dravida tradition, it's less obvious. It's one of the great exceptions to this. Patterns of emanation are, of course, there in the philosophy. But if we look at the temple forms, once the range of types is established, it's a matter of inventive combinations and permutations among those types, rather than that kind of dynamic outflow that we see in the Nagara tradition. In the Karnata Dravida tradition, on the other hand, it's much more like the northern traditions in the way it develops. The same kind of forms at the beginning, and then increasingly stepping out, increasing numbers of projections and forms which interpenetrate and unfold, emerge one from another. So you get a continuous transformation into a form that we can, according to some classifications, refer to as Vesara. And if you don't follow the steps through, you might not realize that it comes from Dravida and is the result of this continuous transformation. So the Nagara and the Karnata Dravida are classic examples of the unfolding pattern of development that I'm talking about. So now let's focus on the Nagara tradition and look at how it develops after the establishment of the Latina form around the beginning of the 7th century. What happens is that you get an increasing stepping out of the wall surfaces, an increasing number of ratas or projections, and those gavakshas that we looked at in the shikara and over the niches, those proliferate. I'd like to mention another Nagara mode or form, the Vallabhi, directly descended from that early Aedicule form with the barrel vaulted roof, related to the Chaitya hall. That becomes monumentalized in stone or in brick and becomes a temple form in its own right, using the same moldings and kit of parts and vocabulary as the Latina. They're two different versions of Nagara temple if we think of the Nagara as a language. Of course, all of this is very much tied up with the Gavaksha form and the geometry which is established for it by the end of the 6th, beginning of the 7th century, which allows the designers to put together whole ones and half ones and other components in all kinds of different ways, and to create this jala or jalaka of proliferating gavakshas. Now, the Latina and Vallabhi modes they develop side by side and they get combined one with another. So if we look at many Latina temples, we see Vallabhi temples projected at the center. That's what we see here in the Parasurameshwara temple at Bhubaneswar in Orissa on the left, and at the brick temple at Kalayat in Haryana on the right. We have a Latina form with a big Vallabhi at the center and two small Vallabhis flanking it. But even in this kind of thing, 10th century Latina form temples, typical, the niches in the walls with their proliferated gavakshas are actually a version of a Vallabhi shrine. And of course, the Sukhanasa, the projection over the antarala, the antechamber of a temple, is conceptually an embedded Vallabhi temple emerging out of the Latina temple. And sometimes you can have 4 of those in a Chaturmukh temple, like the one on the right, which is the temple at Bajaura in Himachal Pradesh. The general tendency is for more and more wall projections and more bhumis or stories in the Shikara marked by the vestigial amlakas, which are the remains of the amlaka-topped pavilions of the proto-Nagara out of which it came. So by the 9th, 10th centuries, the designers have more or less gone through all the possible permutations of this idea. And something new begins to happen, a new cycle of proliferation. These two forms that we could, they're what's known as anek andaka, or not one-egged, the andaka being the amlaka on top of the miniature shikaras. And the one on the right has a Vallabhi form at the center and kuta stampas, which are little shikaras on stampas or pillars at the corner, and a big Latina temple at the center. And the one on the right takes that and as the superstructure and goes one more bhumi, one more level, and we have a cascade of Vallabhi forms at the center. For the moment, let's call this A and B, or proto-Shekari A and B, because they're leading on to the Shekari form, where you have miniature Latina forms emerging from the chest of a larger one. During the 10th century, all kinds of inventive permutations and combinations are created. So that one that I called A is depicted at the center of a more complicated form. And we can go further. So one of those can be at the center of one of those, A at the center of C, or it can, as we've already seen, A can be at the top of B, A becomes the superstructure of B, or in D there we have a combination of all those forms combined into one. Now, during the 11th century, what takes off in central and western India is a classic emanatory sequence of unfolding temple forms. In a very prosaic way, I call those types 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So type 1 is the pristine expression of the Shikari idea. Latina, Shikara, one of those emerging on each face, and Kuta Stambhas, little Shikaras on pillars at the corner. That becomes the top of a more complicated form. So we have 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, bum, 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 bum. And in turn, that becomes the top of a more complicated one. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, and at the same time, the center has been pushing forward, and it becomes a stepped diamond plan. So the corner and the intermediate elements are in one straight line. They're the same size. They're all equally the same size. And if you look at the roof plan, there's a great dense interpenetration of temple forms embedded in one another. Then at a certain stage, it gets more complicated. So we have these half shikaras, and we also have quarter shikaras. 1/4 visible conceptually, 3/4 embedded. So the pattern of 1 with 4 emerging is repeated at a lower level with 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you see the quarters and the halves, but you imagine the 4 embedded forms in the process of coming apart. And then even more complicated, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. If we look at the Kandariya Mahadeva temple at Khajuraho, about 1050, a version of that type 5, it's contrived in such a way that the 4 emerging from 1 is happening at 2 levels on the face of the Shikara. And if we look at the dynamics of that temple, it's like this. We're looking at the dynamic pattern expressed within that single temple, and at the same time, the traces of earlier temple forms which are there present within the Kandariya Mahadeva. So that's the temple as it is. And this is where the emerging, expanding, proliferating forms seem to be going. They dissolve into an undifferentiated continuum. Having reached that stage, what can you do next? Well, the little shikaras have little shikaras coming out of them. The Kutastamba crowns themselves become miniature composite temples. The babies have babies. I'll show you this little snip of this animation, and you can see it on YouTube, called Emanating Temple Forms, which sort of tells that story in 4 minutes if you watch the whole thing. But here's just a glimpse. So, in the last part of this talk, I want to move on to texts, to Shilpa Shastra or Vastu Shastra texts, and look at how this Nagara tradition is treated in some of the texts. And in particular, I want to focus on some recent work I've been doing on a series of temples that appear in a number of different texts at different times in central and in western India. It's a series of 25 temples, starting with one called Keshari. And I first came across it in the Samarangana Sutradhara before I realized that there were later versions of the same series which catch up with practice and keep up with the times. They're not just repeating, they're each time it's telling the story afresh. And the first two temples in the series happen to be those ones that we called A and B, Proto-Shekari types A and B, starting with the Keshari, with the Latina temple, Latina Shikara, 4 little Kuta Stambhas, and a Vallabhi in the center. These are drawings that I've done from the Sanskrit text. And on the right, the second in the series, the one which takes that earlier form as its superstructure and proliferates downwards, is known in these particular texts as the Sarvatobhadra, beautiful on all sides. As usual, they start with the plan, give you a number of bhagas or parts, and then run up the elevation. And they don't tell you everything, you have to fill in all the other details, and I'm just strictly drawing the information that the text tells us. So this series of 25 starts with the Kesari, goes on to the Sarvatobhadra, and ends with a temple called the Meru temple. And it really is a proliferating sequence of the kind that we see when we look at the development of the tradition itself. And the game is that each time you have to add 4 andakas. The andakas are the amlakas at the top of the shikara. So the Kesari has 5 andakas. It's Panch andaka. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4 little Kuta Stambhas and one on the top, one shikara on the top. The Sarvatobhadra has 9, adding 4. The next one has to have 13. Then you have to have whatever it is, 19, and so 4 more every time, and you have to end up with 101. Now, this text, the Samarangana Sutradhara, is the series, the Kesari series, chapter 56, is a little bit divorced from practice. It's almost as if they've got this good idea and they're playing this game, but not all the designs could be realized in an actual building. And it reflects that idea of putting one form at the middle of another. And the text actually explicitly says so. So just to take these ones, 8, 9, 10, Vimana, Himavan, and Himakuta. With the Vimana temple, number 8, they tell you the instructions, and then the text says, oh, look, there's a Sarvatobhadra at the center. So that form that I've shaded in grey in the middle is the form of a Sarvatobhadra at the center of a more complicated form. And the one on the right, Himakuta, has a Latina temple form at the center, which in this particular text is called a Vardhamana temple type. And it explicitly tells you, now we place a Vardhamana at the center. So Samarangana Sutradhara is a central Indian text of the early 11th century. if we move on to the Aparajita Pracha, Western Indian text of the 12th century, we find that same series, the 25 temples starting from Kesari and ending with Meru, but things have moved on and the designs are much more rigorous and can actually be built. And I drew them all I drew all the designs from the text, and I found that those ones that I called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are actually there in the sequence, following on from Kesari and Sarvatopadra. Those types are underlying types, the relationships between the different elements, and then those are varied. This is true in practice as well as in this text. They're varied depending whether you put a little Latina Shikara there, or you put a Famsana or a Samvarana Kuta. So the actual form of the different elements can be varied. And remember, it's only the Amalakas that count as Andakas. So if you want to add 4 more, you can fiddle with the ingredients, and then when you count all the Andakas, you will get, you fiddle with it in order to get the number you want. I don't expect you to take in the whole of this diagram straight away, all the 25 types, but I hope that you can get some sense of the principle and how the unfolding universe, the emanatory sequence of temple forms that we see in actual monuments, is there in the texts. Not that monuments are copying texts. Practice happens first, then practice designs are written about in texts, and then the people writing the texts can invent new forms which later get put into practice. It's the underlying principles and the way of thinking which is there in both the texts and the practice. With my friend and colleague Kailash Rao, in recent years, Kailash has been doing some drone scans of temples. That's one on the left. And the wonderful thing about those is that you can get a true roof plan and a true elevation. And you've got all the proper dimensions within the model. So we could, with that, the help of that, we can actually test ideas and proportions which are there in the texts. And in this particular case, we can, the temple is a little bit irregular, but we can see it more or less fits. In fact, certainly for the central Ura Shringas, it's closer to what I drew from the Aparajita Pracha than the slightly different version that I'd drawn by just looking and thinking about it when I did those earlier drawings. But in the case of this one, the type 3, the Someshvara temple at Kiradu is the example. We can see when we lay the grid over the roof plan, which is a true bird's eye view, that it's exactly following both what is written in the text and the drawing that I drew 20 years ago without looking at any text, but figuring out how the pieces go together. And then this one, type 4, the relationships, if you draw it from the text, the type 4 is there, the relationships are all between the parts are the same, but it's using a different geometry. But then we can go and look at the actual temples and see, do they follow the one in the text or the one I drew? And most of them actually followed the one that I drew, because I was looking at the temples when I drew it. So finally, I think some of you will probably be thinking I just made this up, and those drawings I didn't draw from the text. So I would like to end with one worked example. It's just to show you the process, it's the Indralila temple from the Aparajita Pricha, chapter 159, the 25 temples starting from Kesari. And Indralila is number 13 of the 25. We start with the plan. So we start with a square, and it tells us in a width, this is the translation with the help of Mattia Salvini, translating the Sanskrit and then correlating it with the architecture. In a width of 16 amshas, which means parts, or padas or bhagas, it all means the same. The karna, so we make a square, we make it 16. The karna is 2 bhagas wide. Then there is a nandika in 1 bhaga, and a pratirata of 2 amshas. Now the terminology, it's not just a matter of knowing the terminology, it's a matter of thinking of what kind of temple are they talking about, and getting in the frame of mind. And then when you realize what it is, then the words, the terms, the technical terms change a lot. But once you've got the context, you know where you are. It kind of falls into place. Once again, there should be a nandi of 1 bhaga and a bhadra 4 amshas wide. Everything has matching projection, which means it's what I call a stepped diamond plan. It means the different elements, they're all in line. In the bhadra, the projection is 1 bhaga. So we know that the bhadra, the central projection, projects 1 square out. So essentially, we now have the outer perimeter of the plan. We double it up. We now have half the plan of the prasada. The garbha is 64 bhagas. Now, 64, it's only 16 across, so we realize that the 64, it must be 8 times 8. So it must be 8 squares, 8 parts, enclosed by 1 bhaga of walls. Now, in this particular text, it's describing these temples as sandhara with an ambulatory. So we know that there's an inner wall, and the outer wall should be 1 bhaga, while the brahmantika should be 2 bhagas. So we know from the context that brahmantika must be the andhara, the andharaka, the pradakshinapata, the passageway around. So now we have the plan, we might elaborate it a little, and we need to remember that the plan is taken at the kura, the hoof, at in the kumbha, the base molding of the vedibanda, the molded base. And so essentially we have the plan. Now it's told us the talamana, the plan measurement, and now it's going to tell us the urdhvamana, which is the upper measurement or the elevation. So it says one should build 2 shringas in the karna. Now the shringas in this context are the mini shikaras. While the shikara has a width like the suns, which means 12, there are 12 suns, so it must be talking about the big shikara on the top, the Mula Manjari. In the Nandika, there is a Tilaka. The Nandika is the little projection between the two main ones. And a Tilaka means a Famsana or a Samvarana Kuta, which means one of those, or a bell-shaped thing, which doesn't count as an Andaka. So we put those there. And the Pratyanga is 2 bhagas. Now the Pratyanga, we can work it out. It must mean, and it does mean, we know from other texts, it means the quarter shikara either side of the half shikara. That is the Pratyanga. There are 2 shringas in the Pratirata, 1, 2, and an Ura shringa of 4 amshakas. And that may be one of those cases where I thought it can't be 4, it's got to be 6. There are 2 shringas in the Pratirata, and an Ura shringa of 6. Oh, of 6. The Ura shringa is 6. I must have lost my place. 2 shringas in the Nandika, and an Ura shringa of 4 amshakas. So we get another Ura shringa of 4. It was all right, and I got it right. Yeah, hooray! And a Bhadra shringa of 2 bhagas, and the projection is half of the shringa. So it's 2 wide, and it projects out by 1. In the Karna and in the Pratirata, it is adorned by Udakantaras, which means the Jalantaras, Salilantaras, the water channels, which literally is the recesses. So it's telling us the obvious, what we know, that between the projections there are recesses. So we now have the shikara, and of course that sits over the walls. And we add the walls, and Indralila. This was the Indralila type of temple. I hope that all made sense. Thank you very much.